Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. We've touched upon the Spanish Civil War in previous episodes. When the war came to an end, there was a large number of displaced Spanish Republicans living in France and to a lesser extent other European countries. With war looming, the French began to recruit these displaced men into their armed forces, and when France fell in 1940, a sizeable number found themselves in Britain, where they were recruited into the British Army. But they weren't just in Britain. In North Africa and the Middle East, Spaniards signed up to fight with the British. In this episode, I'm joined by military historian and hispanist Sean Scullion to explore who these men were and their stories. Sean, thanks for joining me. So does our story start in France and with the large number of Spanish refugees living there after the Civil War?
It is. So what you've got is Spaniards joining the British Army. You've got two waves, really. You've got a wave at the beginning of the war, 1940, maybe 1941, and a second wave, 1943, 1944. And basically, at the end of the Spanish Civil War, you've got what is known as La Retirada. The Retirada is the big withdrawal of the Spanish Republican Army and a load of refugees crossing over in the Pyrenees, mostly on the Catalan side. And you've got a figure of around 500,000 people at that stage who suddenly appear in the space of around 6 weeks on the French side. Now, the French, they were prepared for it to a certain extent. I mean, there are lots of different conflicting figures about the numbers of Spanish who end up in France between January and May 1939. But most people have fallen on the figure of around 500,000, of whom around 200,000 were from the Republican Army. Now, quite a lot of that 500,000, that remaining 300,000 that were left over roughly, quite a lot of those end up going back to Spain, but they're not people of a fighting age, and therefore they don't have as much to lose. So you've got around the 200,000 mark are Republican Army people, or very politicized people. And as you're probably aware, a lot of those individuals are people who have joined the Republican Army either quite early on or at some stage in the Spanish Civil War. And therefore they are, quite a lot of them have fought, already quite a lot of times, and quite a lot of them probably have started their military career properly in the Republican Army at the Battle of the Ebro the previous year. But really, the French, when they have this massive wave of people coming across the border, they are really struggling to deal with this humanitarian crisis, is what it is. They're mostly interned in what the Spanish called concentration camps. We would just call them internment camps. Southern half of France, the Pyrenean side, the Mediterranean end of the Pyrenees is where the largest blob of them are. Some of them are moved off to different areas, and there are some other camps that are further over to the west, Basque Country, places like that. But basically, you've got this large lump. And then what basically happens then is the French start to pass a series of laws in order to make use of these Spaniards. And they send a series of recruiting teams into a lot of the camps to try and get them to join the French Foreign Legion or French foreign battalions, which aren't necessarily the Legion. They're allowed to get them into the Legion or into French foreign battalions, but they can't actually physically join the French army because that's not the way the French work. And hence why the French Foreign Legion is the French Foreign Legion. They also then set up a status for these Spaniards, and they called prestataires militaires étrangers. So they're basically pressed into service. And a lot of these prestataires, or these PMEs, PME as they're called, become members of the Compagnie de Travailleurs Étrangers, so CTEs, CTE, which are like the foreign workers companies. And we are literally talking about hundreds of these companies being set up by the French, made up of Spaniards. So by April 1940, you've got a second series of laws have been passed. The first set was in the spring of 1939. Second set was in January 1940. By April 1940, you've got around 100,000 Republican soldiers who've been pressed into service. about 50,000 of those are in these working companies, 40,000 or so are working in industry, and around 10, 12,000, the figures are still a bit grey, are in the military, are actually physically in the army, French Foreign Legion, all these foreign battalions. And these foreign battalions also make up these, what they call the Regiment de Marche Volunteer Étrangère. And these are formed mostly out of Spanish, Polish troops. And you've got the 21st, 22nd, 23rd RMVEs. And these are battalions and regiments that fight in against the Germans. A lot of these battalions are actually based in the Verdun, kind of Alsace area. I don't necessarily see that much action initially at the beginning of the invasion of France by the Germans, but actually some of them end up having to be in that rear guard action fought, because a lot of people, obviously, the French have never been that happy about the way we represent them at Dunkirk. The French did actually carry on fighting for another month after Dunkirk, and these Spanish labour companies were part of that. You've also got these 10 to 12,000 soldiers, of which quite a lot were in the Foreign Legion, and a lot of these end up being sent overseas straight away as soon as they join, whether it be 1939 or early 1940. What basically happens is some of them get sent to North Africa, some of them get sent to the Middle East, some of those get brought back to France to fight the Germans. Some of them get brought back and then end up in Norway, and that's where you've got the famous 13th Half Brigade that fought in Narvik. But they basically end up coming back to the UK, because they go to the UK on their way to Norway and end up coming back to UK after actually being in France briefly and then coming back to the UK. You've got a whole series there, and you've got other little battalions, other battalions and marching regiments that end up in Syria, like I say. And as I've quoted before, a large amount of the Free French Army that was based in the UK by August 1940 under de Gaulle. You know, de Gaulle's forces weren't that huge. Most of them were overseas. There weren't that many in Britain. There's a large amount of them that are actually Spanish.
So they're pulled out with are they somehow attached to the BEF and pulled out, or are there other units?
No, so basically what happens is that you've got a whole series of French units, French Foreign Legion, for example. You've got a series of French Foreign Legion units. They don't necessarily fight in France that much. There aren't that many of them. They're mostly overseas. This 13th Brigade end up being in Norway and then end up via France very briefly, because by then it's June and it's too late. They end up back in the UK. But actually in France, you've got quite a lot of activity. The Spaniards are, some people quote 8,000 Spaniards that were wiped out. That figure's pretty much untrue. We're talking probably closer to 2,000 or 3,000. But what is certain is that there were around 8,000 Spaniards in labour companies supporting the French army or the BEF in that May-June period. A lot of them ended up going further south and supporting the rest of the French army, but you do get this lump of Spanish labour companies, end up doing that. But just to go back a little bit, when the BEF deployed to France in 1939, they realise that they are in a dire need of a labour force to support them, and they don't have enough pioneers. So they start to look at striking a deal with the French to get these prestataires militaires étrangers, these PMEs, and they end up deciding that they're going to go with some Italians who are based in France and the Spaniards. And in September 1939, the French release these prestataires militaires étrangers and these Italians, and there are around 4 or 5 of these labour companies that are attached to the BEF. And the most famous of these is the 185th Labour Company. They end up supporting the BEF in Brittany and in Normandy. They're actually formed fully in Gurs Camp. Now, Gurs Camp is in the Basque Country. It seemed to have whole companies formed from it, not just for the British, but also for the French. And what ended up happening was that in 1939, when the BEF arrived, they sent officers down to Gore's camp to form a specific company to support the BEF. And this 185th Labour Company was the one that was formed. It had a British officer in charge, Captain Smith, who was later to become Major Smith, and he actually commanded the number 1 Spanish company later on. I'll cover them later on. And basically, they're formed in Gore's camp. They move north, and they support the Auxiliary Pioneer Corps in La Chapelle-Launay, which is in Normandy and near Saint-Nazaire. And basically, they spend most of their time before May-June 1940 supporting railway construction and doing some warehouse work and things like that. So they're not at the front line, but they're part of BEF. Their second in command was Spanish. He was an old Policarpov pilot from the Spanish Republican Air Force, Ferrandiz. And Ferrandiz, he kind of runs the company on a day-to-day basis, and Captain Smith makes the decisions. And basically, they have a really good relationship with the British side. They find the whole, having been in an internment camp for several months, some of them nearly for a year, to be paid, to wear uniform, to be in accommodation, that's really good. And there's a guy called Miguel Montañez, and there's another guy called Antonio Grande. They both do some really good accounts of their time in the 185th Labour Company. Sadly, only 16 of that company make it to England. The others are all then re-interned and sent to Labour camps supporting the Germans. And this is the fate of the majority of the Spaniards who are in the French army supporting them in these Labour companies. They then get re-interned. Some of them end up in the camps they were in when they crossed over the border back to the south of France. Some of them end up in the concentration camps like Mauthausen and places like that. And some of them then get absorbed into slave labour and end up in amazing places like Jersey, Bordeaux, building the West Wall for the Todt group. You can actually see some engravings of people's names in the concrete in Jersey when you go there, and there is a large Spanish community that was forced labour there. So that's that. But I mean, those 8,000 Spaniards I'm talking about, you're talking about roughly about 30 companies numbered around 85th company to 120th company, and 50 companies numbered from 120th to 175th or something like that. They are the ones that support the BEF and the French in the north, in Flanders and that area going further east. Some of them do actually end up in Dunkirk, and some of them are able to cross the water with the Operation Dynamo. And you've got obviously a couple of other stories where you've got these Spaniards who end up. There are 3 or 4 companies that end up being in the final defensive positions around Dunkirk itself. These guys aren't actually armed. Some of them do take up arms. There are other stories of some of them taking up arms and fighting to the death. There is a chunk of one of the war cemeteries in Dunkirk with Spaniards in it, which is very interesting, worth visiting. I had a really long chat with the Spanish Historical Society of Dunkirk, and they've really been helpful as well to give me a bit more facts and figures, and that'll be in the book. Olivier Vermersch, his name is. He's been very helpful, and he's put some myths to bed. There are a few myths about the Spaniards fighting to the death. Well, yes, some of them did, but not all of them. Most of them were just basically helping in the rear areas and weren't able to because they weren't armed. So so you end up then having this higgledy-piggledy group of people in the summer of 1940 who end up in Britain, whether it be the 13th Brigade, Half Brigade from Narvik, whether it be some of the Spaniards who come from the mainland France. So you've got roughly around 500 Spaniards who end up getting to the UK.
At which point, where does their allegiance lay? So if you arrive in the UK, France falls, are you still part of the French army? Can they?
Well, they signed a contract, whether it be for the duration of the war or for 5 years. And that's one of the reasons why you get this move over of people in 1943, 1944. And also some of these people end up joining the British Army straight after Dunkirk, etc., because as far as they were concerned, the war was over for France. So therefore they wanted to come over to the British side. So you've got all of that. But what you do get is you get this large chunk. There are around 600 Spaniards in the 13th Half Brigade, of whom about 300 decide they are going to stay in Britain, and the other 300 end up joining the Free French Army under de Gaulle. And these 300 who decide to join the British make up the backbone of the number one Spanish company. But basically, yeah, you're talking about a lot of these Spaniards coming to Britain, but then obviously you've got others in Syria, you've got others in North Africa, you've got, in Syria, for example, you've got a gang of them who are in one of these Foreign Legion battalions who are able to get across the border to Palestine and join the British Army, 60 odd of them, 63, 65, the number's still not exactly 100% confirmed. That you've got a whole group of them. Then the largest group of Spaniards then joined the British Army in 1943 after Operation Forge, and that's a really, really huge exodus. We're talking just under 800 Spaniards who joined the British Army then, and most of those joining the Pioneer Corps. But overall you've got people who join the Pioneer Corps, you've got people who join the infantry, you've got people who join the commandos and are really, really key to joining the commandos. I can cover that in a bit. You've also then got people who are actually in the SAS. And I know you've spoken to a few people in your podcast before about some of the SAS operations, especially in Italy. So you've got people serving across the whole of the British Army, across the whole of Western Europe, basically, and Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Mediterranean. But at the beginning of the war, it's a bit of a mess. You've got this core of people in the UK. Well, it was a bit of a mess anyway, wasn't it? I mean, you've got all these people who are this core of people in the UK, and then at the later stages, you have these other people joining them. So it is quite complicated. These people's journeys are very complicated in many ways, because you've got people who come from a very humble background, who are forced into a civil war in their own country. They fight for what they believe is right. They're quite heavily politicized. They are forced to flee across the border. They're interned. Some cases, it's the devil you do or the devil you don't, and they have no choice. They have to join the French military. They don't necessarily enjoy that life either, because they're on a losing side in 1940, or they're forced into going to somewhere like in the Middle East or North Africa, and they're not sure how to go. So by the time they're in the British Army, these people have, they've got quite a lot of experience, and you've got some amazing stories about some of the Spaniards who fought in the French Foreign Legion, for example, in Narvik. There's a couple of instances of individuals who, took out whole machine gun nests in the snow and all of this. They were very hardened fighters. They were taking the fight to the enemy, and there were quite a few Spanish casualties in Narvik and later on as well.
How did the British view them? Because it strikes me, you're right, you're kind of it's such a strange background that they've come from. You could also throw in, well, how reliable are they? Do we want them as a fighting unit? Because obviously the Poles and French all fight in their own units, and they're not rear echelon troops.
Yes, I think there are a couple of points to go with that. First of all, you've already got the legacy of the Spanish Civil War, and you've got this whole business of people who fought in the international brigades being watched and all of this. And the majority of the Spaniards were regarded as Reds. Let's be honest about it. They were regarded as Reds by the British authorities. But I think as the war went along, it became more of a needs must, and there was a realization that these Spaniards could bring a lot to the British Army. And a lot of these Spaniards were quite happy to serve in the British Army, because they found it, they quite liked being in the British Army, to be honest, because it was quite civilized, really. They got paid. They even got into drinking tea and having naffy breaks, stuff that they would never have imagined, I don't think. And a lot of them really assimilated to British life at the end of World War II, married into British families. There was a lot of reticence. But if you were to say, for example, if we were going to start now with more about the Pioneer Corps, the number one Spanish company. So, as I said, the number one Spanish company is this amazing mixture of people who come from lots of different backgrounds. the majority are Spaniards who fought in the French Foreign Legion, who were in Norway, like I say, and they come back from Norway, some of them via France. They're interned, and initially they're going to be sent off somewhere to be part of Vichy France. And of course, the Spanish don't want to have anything to do with this. This is ridiculous. So then they get imprisoned. They get put into a camp that has barbed wire around it. And then they're looking at embarking from Bristol to go to North Africa, again linked in with Vichy France. And they have a sit-down protest. They all go, basically, they all say they're not going to join Vichy France. And don't forget, we're talking 600 Spaniards in the 13th Brigade. 300 of those are the ones that end up staying in Britain. So after all these protests, they all get put in prison in Stafford. And it's then when the French are thinking they might shoot a few just to kind of, encourager les autres, that kind of thing. And that's when the British step in and say, right, enough's enough. And then they interview these individuals who are in Stafford prison, and they realise that, they can employ them. So they join the Auxiliary Pioneer Corps, and the number 1 Spanish company is formed in Westward Ho. I think it's formed actually in July 1940, but actually really doesn't become a company as such until September 1940 in Westward Ho. They have people from the Narvik gang. You've got people, those 16 people who managed to escape from the 185th Company. A few others come from different directions. Each of these companies, these pioneer companies, is 250 strong. Some of them are 280, some of them are even 300. So they're quite big. That's a big company size grouping. Normally a company size grouping is no more than 150. But with the Pioneer Corps, they were a lot bigger. And that company had, all the officers were British or British Spanish speakers. Some of them had South American backgrounds. And actually later on in the war, the company is commanded by Smith, who is really pleased to see those 15, 16 that had got away from 185th Company. So that's quite cool. The 15 or 16 of them are really happy. Some of these Spaniards who come off the boat from Narvik or come over from France, who are not sent back, and don't get me wrong, there's quite a few of them are sent back with the French forces. Some of them say, we don't want to join the British military. We actually would like to work in a munitions factory or something like that. So some of them end up staying in the UK, but are working for the war industry, let's say, and end up doing that. But what happens is that if you were to look at the war diaries of the number 1 Spanish company, it's actually pretty quiet the first 18 months or so. They're in the UK, they don't go anywhere. And a lot of it's, they're on the south coast, they're in Plymouth, they do a bit here and they do a bit there. They do some stuff with the New Zealand Forestry Company. They're doing stuff like that. And the reason why it's not so busy is because December 1940, SOE decides it needs to have some Spaniards to make up a series of teams to carry out operations behind German lines if they should invade the Iberian Peninsula. And basically, teams of about 20 or so Spaniards from the number 1 Spanish company start going through the SOE training cycle. They go to Scotland, they go through all the different centres to learn explosives, they learn telecommunications, and slowly but surely, the numbers build up. So by the time we get to 1943, 140 of those Spaniards from the number 1 Spanish company have been trained by the SOE. Now, hardly any of them are used in the end because obviously there is no invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, but quite a lot of them, having carried out a lot of that training, end up being used by the SOE or by special forces later on in the war. And there's a couple of examples. But what's really interesting is when Quennell, who is the head of H section, which is like the Iberia section of SOE, when he visits Westward Ho, he starts recruiting his first batch. And what we're talking about is that some of the individuals that are training them or involved with them are actually people that we love and know from spy stories and things like that. That if you were to read Bernard O'Connor's book, Bernard has written quite extensively on. It's called Blowing Up Iberia. It's a really good book. And if you were to read through that, you'll see that Kim Philby writes a lot of the reports on how well the Spaniards are doing. And then you've got Ian Fleming, who's actually writing the operations orders for the potential operations that will be taking place in the Iberian Peninsula. So straight away, you've got two individuals there that we know, Kim Philby, and Ian Fleming, 440 random Spaniards being trained by the SOE, and they're being trained by Kim Philby, and Ian Fleming's writing, doing the operations that they might be involved with. That's pretty amazing. But these Spaniards are called sconces. A lot of these sconces were given parachute training as well, so that they could be parachuted into parts of Spain and everything else. But also, these sconces were going to be supported by a series of relators. And these relators were British officers who were basically fluent Spanish speakers, who either had lived in Spain or in South America, knew the language pretty well. And initially, the plans were that these relators were going to do different things to the sconces. Sconces were going to work with a partisan type and train them on bomb-making skills and all of that. And the relators were going to be doing other things and working in smaller teams. But as the plan evolved, some of these sconces and relators were going to be merged together. And some of these sconces were going to be led by relators. And one of the most famous one of these relators was a guy called Peter Kemp. Peter Kemp was a Cambridge graduate who was studying for the bar and decided at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, he was an ardent anti-communist. He decided to join Franco's army. And he decided to do that. And he ended up in the Requetés, he ended up in the Spanish Foreign Legion. And at the end of the Spanish Civil War, he returned to the UK. And he was taken on by SOE. Given his Spanish background, he was put in charge of doing some of the training and ended up being a relator. Now, he was going to be put in charge of one of these teams of sconces. So you can imagine if they'd ever met, that would have been a very interesting story. When the whole operation folded, he then ended up working in the Balkans and ended up working with Tito's partisans. And then he became a gun for hire after World War II, and ended up having a lot of adventures in Africa and things like that. So he was a bit of an adventurer more than anything else. But yeah, so you've got these SOE trained people, and not many of them are actually used, but some of them are. At the end of the war in 1944, 1945, around a dozen of them were used because they had radio handling skills, they had parachute training. They were used to support the SOE for D-Day and other things like that in France. An example of that is a guy called Esteban Molina, whose son is Alfred Molina, famous Hollywood actor. Here, Esteban Molina was regarded as a good radio handler and therefore was used to support the SOE just before D-Day. And I haven't proved it yet, but I'm starting to find some information that might prove that he was also involved with the SAS, because the SAS numbers were increased quite severely for D-Day. Hence why I think that a few of these number one Spanish company SOE trained people may have been supporting the SAS because they've been trained by the SOE, so they may have ended up doing that. So yeah, so that's the kind of SOE thing element of number one Spanish company. But then number one Spanish company receives all of these SOE people back, not all of them, a few of them. There are a couple of scandals, of course. There's a guy in the number one Spanish company who gets stabbed. You wouldn't have a Spanish story without a good stabbing. You've also got two individuals who were trained by the SOE who actually sold their secrets, who went to the Spanish embassy. These people were tracked, and Bernardo O'Connor's book got some really good accounts of how they were interviewed and asked why they did it. So quite interesting, really. Some of the reports on the individuals who were in the SOE training are quite interesting. I think the British did find the Spanish quite fiery, their fiery temper. Once they were in the UK, a lot of them found this freedom quite amazing, because obviously a lot of them had been in internment camps for a long period. So actually meeting people of the opposite sex was a real revelation to them.
I imagine for SOE it must cause some conniptions, because I think there's some spying activity going on in the Spanish embassy that's feeding back to Germany of some description. So SOE must have been all over these guys. Oh, would you stop having these women and affairs? And
Well, SOE and SIS. I mean, there was a slight difference between the two. Obviously, the SIS were the ones that were doing a lot of the tracking of the Spaniards to see if this information was getting through, and of course it did. I mean, Franco was aware of these sconces. He was aware that they existed. He was aware that there were reports being written in the Spanish embassy in London and going back to Spain. That would eventually go back to Germany, obviously. There was a very clear line of information going, in various directions. So the company kind of becomes whole again, and it is due to be in the second wave on D-Day. It was due to be like around the 8th or the 10th of June. But actually, in the end, because of the Mulberry Harbour's the second Mulberry Harbour being destroyed, they don't end up arriving in Normandy until August 1944. In that build-up before then, they're really heavily into their forestry. They're doing a lot of work with wood. So they end up in France. They move into Belgium, and by the end of the war, you're talking about the troops being very close to the Belgian, Luxembourg-German border, in the depths of the Ardennes, basically. And there's a few stories about the Battle of the Bulge and things like that, but they don't see any actual active service. They are joined towards the end of 1944 by 60 extra people who come from the 361 Pioneer Company. 361 Pioneer Company are one of the many pioneer companies that are formed in North Africa after Operation Torch. And 3 of those companies, 361, 362, and 363, end up being dispatched from North Africa to the UK in 1944 to support D-Day and everything else. And 60 members of 361 end up supporting the number 1 Spanish company. So by the time they're in the Ardennes, they're over 300 strong. It's a very strong company, and they're doing a lot of woodwork in order to support bridging, roads, other construction, and they're busy. They're busy. So these guys, they've seen a lot, and the company gets disbanded in early 1946.
It's interesting that they train a lot of them to do all this potential SOE work, and then when they return back, they just go back to being pioneers. They don't, train them into commandos or another infantry unit.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And a lot of these people didn't talk about their SOE activities at all. It's only in the last 10 years that the paperwork's been available at the National Archives that you've actually been able to read into this. A lot of these papers were only released in 2015, I think. That's why Bernard O'Connor's book is quite interesting, because he's the first person to have delved into the archives. Daniel Arasa, in his book that he wrote in the 90s, he does talk about it, but that's only through interviews with these individuals. He doesn't have any actual material because he wasn't able to access it. But then, a lot of these people were pretty much sworn to secrecy. A lot of the guys who did the SOE, they signed the official Secrets Act, and they were not allowed to talk about it. It's only until recently that you've heard a lot about the SOE activities, to be honest. And of course, probably one of the most famous Spaniards who was involved in the secret side of the Allied effort was Garbo. Garbo was a Catalan. He was Spanish, and he was the big double agent, of course. He's one of those people that's come to light in the last 15, 20 years where people realize, hang on a minute, he wasn't French, he wasn't German, he wasn't British, he was Spanish. All right, okay. So that's quite interesting. But then you've got other pioneers. You've got all the pioneers that are formed in North Africa after Torch. You've got a lot of companies. You've got 337, 338, 361, 362, 363, 364, 401. They're all pioneer companies formed in North Africa by the British Army after Torch to support the British Army effort in the middle of the Mediterranean.
Is this French units coming over to the Allied side, or are they picking up Spanish who've never been involved coming over from Morocco? And
well, it's a mixture. You've got in North Africa, you've got people who've been interned, and you've also got people who've been in the French armed forces under Vichy, or as you know, across North Africa, it was a bit of a mishmash of Vichy and Free French, and obviously the largest group of Free French were in Senegal initially, and then they all moved up and all this stuff. So it's a real mishmash. So it was basically a lot of these Spaniards did not want to. For them, the war was over for the French, or in some cases, they were, their 5-year contract was up, so they could leave. So they end up joining the pioneers. But the thing is that some of these pioneers end up joining weird and wonderful groups like the SAS and other, amazing stories like that. So, one of those examples is a guy called Juan Torrents, who then became John Coleman. He's got a son called Cliff Coleman, who's an artist. He's based in Galicia, and he's one of these people who's North Africa. He's gets across, joins the Pioneer Corps, goes and does some training. There's a place called Philippeville where they had a special forces kind of training center, parachuting and everything like that, and that's where a lot of the initial elements of some of the SAS from North Africa who are non-British were trained. And you've got another guy called Canovas. He was another person who joined the Pioneer Corps in 1943, but he ends up joining the SOE. He gets parachute training in Philippeville. He ends up being sent into Foix, into southern France, not far from Toulouse. And basically, his background is amazing. His family was originally his move to Foix in the early 1900s. They were forced to go back to Spain. Then they were forced to leave Spain to go back to Foix after the Spanish Civil War. But then he gets interned or ends up in North Africa. I can't remember exactly how now. But he ends up joining the Pioneers, going into SOE, and he's parachuted in to work with Spanish partisans. And this is, of course, the big story about the Spanish who made up the Maquis and the resistance in France. You could draw a line across the bottom third of France and say that the majority of people who were in the resistance movements, especially Pyrenees area, the Mediterranean area towards Spain, were made up of Spaniards. Huge amounts of Spaniards in the Maquis, and these are the people who managed not to be captured by the French Vichy or Germans at the beginning of at the end of 1940. But Canovas ends up in Foix. He ends up working really well with this Spanish Maquis battalion, and they end up capturing Foix. And as a consequence of his bravery, he gets given the military medal. He's another one of these people. So that's the pioneers. That's the majority of the troops who served in the British Army there. There's quite a few more stories, which I'll cover as we go.
So presumably, they don't see much action necessarily in North Africa. So presumably they're picking him up from North Africa, and then it's into Italy and into the Northwest Europe.
To a certain extent, yeah. So 2 or 3 of those companies end up dealing with prisoners of war, being guards at ports. Some of them end up in Sicily. A few of them end up in Africa. Not that many. A few of them end up in Africa. And yes, they do end up kind of mostly being North Africa based and not going anywhere. And when the end of the war comes, those who have not ended up in Britain end up staying in North Africa, and hence why there is bizarrely a large Pied Noir, Spanish Pied Noir community in Algeria. It's certainly an area I need to look at a lot more. Are these pioneer companies formed in North Africa, and the activities of the Spaniards in North Africa generally, because you've got stuff going on in Morocco, you've got stuff going on in Algeria, you've got stuff going on in Tunisia, and a lot of these people become free in 1942, 42, and 43, and therefore they can do something, of that they feel is more of use, and a lot of them end up in the British. And as I say, there are 794 documented Spaniards joining the British Army in North Africa in 1942-43.
It's interesting that the British kept them as pioneer companies. It's just, I wonder, if it's if there's a sort of a strange identity thing where the British don't quite know what to do with them, insofar as, hang on, these have been, there could be reds in the bed kind of thing, or where they could disappear over the night. They could just leave and desert. Where's their allegiance?
Exactly. I mean, I think a lot of them had had enough of working with the French, so it was very clear that they were eager to work with the British, and a lot of them wanted to work with the Americans, but the Americans weren't having many kind of foreign labour kind of elements, especially in North Africa initially. So the British already had a very strong reputation and a very strong tradition of having people from other countries working in there. As I said, it's an army of the empire. So not a lot of these companies were called alien companies. So, that's fair enough. But actually, if we move on slightly, I'll talk now a little bit about the 60 odd or so Spaniards that made up the commandos in the Middle East.
So are they attached to the LRDG?
Basically, I was telling you about these marching battalions that were in the French army, foreign marching battalions. Well, one of the most famous ones was the 11e Bataillon de Marche, and they end up in Syria. Got a large amount of Spaniards in them. 63 of these Spaniards, when when France capitulates and people don't really know what's going to happen, a load of Spaniards want to leave the French army, and a lot of them are stopped. But 63 of them, some people say 65, I'll stick with 63 at the moment. 63 managed to commandeer some trucks and get across the Syrian-Palestinian border to go and join the British army. And this is where I've got to thank a guy called Donny Fajardo. His father, Joaquin Fajardo, was in, again, amazing story, Pyrenees, France, joins the French Legion, goes over to Syria, and he is one of these people that ends up going across to the British Army in 1940. His story, I think, is amazing. He's quite an important person in my story in some ways, because not only is he one of the individuals that helps them cross the border, and basically they get to the border and there's this French official or some sort of border guard, and they can't get past this person. So Joaquin Fajardo just jumps out of his truck, gets his rifle, smacks him on with it, and then they cross the border. They get across the border, and then the British don't know what to do with them. The British have already received a load of Poles. A load of Poles managed to get away from the French, who were serving in the French Foreign Legion. So they've already had a load of Poles. So they don't really know what to do with them. And initially, all of these Spaniards become members of the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey. So they're all taken on the books of Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey. They're all given regimental numbers as if they're members of the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey. But at the same time, in August 1940, the Middle Eastern Commandos are being formed in Geneva. And so the decision is made, okay, they're on the books of Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, but we're going to make them commandos. So they make up the majority of a company. There's about 130 people in a company. So over half of a company in 50 Middle Eastern Commando is formed up of Spaniards. And there were 3 commandos set up. There's 50 Middle Eastern Commando, 51 Middle Eastern Commando, 52 Middle Eastern Commando. Now, I have it on good authority, but I haven't been able to prove it yet. There are probably some other Spaniards in 51 Commando, but I haven't been able to track those down. There is a mythical 300. There are various accounts, 3 or 4 accounts that talk about 300 Spaniards getting across the border into Palestine. I have only been able to physically find 63. So I'll work on 63. But there are some accounts that talk about 300 managing to join the British Army. Now, if that was to be the case, then that would substantiate a couple of other things that have been claimed by other people. But you know what it's very much like. A myth becomes a myth, becomes a myth. So sometimes you just got to go with what you know. So I'm sticking to the 63. So they basically become members of 51 Middle Eastern Commando. The commanding officer of 50 Middle Eastern Commando was Lieutenant Colonel George Young, who then became Colonel George Young, DSO, famous for being the president of the Escape Committee in Colditz later on in the war. You can listen to his personal memoirs. He was interviewed by the Imperial War Museum. You can listen to them online. Very, very interesting. And he talks about Spaniards quite a lot, so it's very useful. Basically, what happens is that by March 1940, the 50, 51, and 52 have done various operations. 50 hasn't been that as busy as the others. It has been out and about, but it hasn't actually been involved in firefights as much as 51 and 52. 51 and 52 have been involved in Abyssinia and all of that. And they've taken casualties and lots of things have happened. And by March 1941, Bob Laycock's arrived and he's set up Lay Force, which is the nascent commando force in the Middle East, a proper commando force, because obviously by then you're talking about people being trained in Scotland and all of that. And 50 Commando is merged with 52 Commando and becomes the battalion of Lay Force. This Lay Force is then sent to Crete in May 1941. And as I say, by then, the CO of the D Battalion is George Young. So these Spaniards, they've done lots of things. They've been on ops, but some of these operations haven't actually happened, on the bus, off the bus, or off the boat in these cases. And basically what they've done is they've embarked and they've gone to Crete, and they arrive on the 27th of May, 1941, which is the day that Freiburg says, by the way, we're leaving. And so the decision is made that they are going to be used as the cover force for the troop withdrawal south to Sfakia on the southern coast of Crete. All the Spaniards are in B Company of D Battalion of Ley Force. And their officer commanding is a Major McGibbon. Major McGibbon, he has a lot of time for the Spaniards. He knows them pretty well, and he in the accounts he talks very highly of them. So he is given orders by Young that B Company has now got to be the rear guard of the rear guard. And on the 28th of May, along with some Maoris, they go forward towards the enemy. So they go north towards the enemy to take a ridge, to then hold that ridge as long as they can to kind of put off the Germans as much as they can. So he's going against the current. So he's got the Spaniards with him. He's taking the Spaniards with him. He's telling the Spaniards, by the way, the British don't normally do this. They don't run away like, we're going this way, follow me, men, kind of thing. And they have this big firefight, and they are able to hold off the Germans fairly well. But McGibbon is injured. Quite a lot of them are taken prisoner, or some are killed. And basically, the company ceases to exist as a fighting unit pretty much from that point onwards. And the remainder of what's left of the company gets merged into the battalion. And the battalion then carries on being that rear guard fighting element for the force all the way to Sfakia. And on the 1st of June, the early hours of 1st of June, the evacuation is stopped, and George Young is forced to be the person that is going to surrender to the Germans. So he takes his commandos to one side and tells them, by the way, you can go and escape into the hills if you want. And quite a few of them do, and quite a few of the Spaniards do. And probably the most famous one of those is a guy called Francisco Geronimo, who later becomes Frank Williams. Frank Williams, ends up becoming a member of 2 SAS. And he escapes into the hills, and he's able to stay out in the hills for 11 months, avoids capture. There are loads of adventures. He has loads of adventures. He manages, because obviously he's quite Mediterranean in his look and everything. He's able to get away with it. Obviously, Spanish accent sounds a bit Greek, so he's able to get away with it quite a bit. Those who were taken prisoner, 35 of those are Spaniards, and those 35 end up being taken to Thessaloniki and then to Poland, Germany, places like that, and they're moved around a bit as you would expect. Joaquin Fajardo, he is one of these POWs. So I've got some amazing accounts of what goes on in on the POW camps. He makes some really good friends. Sadly, 2 of the Spaniards are killed in some sort of air raid or artillery attack from the Russians towards the end of the war. And one of those is a really good friend of his, so quite hard for him towards the end of the war. There's probably the second most amazing story that links fascist Spaniards to Republican Spaniards is when Joaquin Fajardo is working on a railway line outside a railway station. They're in Germany at this stage, Eastern Germany. He gets up and starts throwing stones and shouting at these people who are in a train. And people wondering what he's doing, and they kind of catch up with him and kind of pull him down. And he's swearing in Spanish and all this stuff, and they're wondering why he is. It turns out that it's the Spanish División Azul, the Blue Division, the Spaniards who fought for Germany in World War II on the Eastern Front. They're on their way through. So you've got this kind of meeting of people again, just like you did with Peter Kemp. I just think that's pretty amazing. It kind of brings it all to very sharp light, and that's been backed up by other eyewitnesses. So that's quite amazing. So they're in these POW camps. They get released at the end of the war. And the irony, of course, is that the 35 Spaniards who are taken prisoner of war have never been in Britain, but they're released in Britain. And of course, they're paranoid about being taken back to Spain or being sent to concentration camps because they're Republican Spaniards. But an Australian or New Zealand doctor who's with them in Thessaloniki, says, look, why don't you just say you're Gibraltarian? So they get away with it.
How did they get away with it with the Germans? Because surely, did the Germans realise they were Spanish, or did they pretend to be?
No. They said they were Gibraltarians straight away. So all of their POW paperwork has them down as Gibraltarian.
Well, from your point of view, do you not just have to go through the archives and look for all the prisoners of war who were from Gibraltar?
Well, yes, but, it is war. I mean, I don't know if you know, but there was a huge prison exchange. About 3,000 or 5,000 prisoners were exchanged in Barcelona in the middle of the war. Yeah, I mean, and some of those were people from Crete. I'm trying to see if a couple of those might have been Spaniards from Crete. Which would be amazing if that was the case. I haven't managed to find out much more about that yet. But so they're sent back. But then you've got these other 30 or so who are able to get away, or who even weren't in Crete in the first place, because not all of the 60 odd went to Crete. Some of them were already injured or were quite ill. And basically, there are loads of loose ends with them. I've got potentially them being on the books of D Squadron, one Special Service Regiment, which became one SAS. I've also got a few of them who ended up in the SAS, obviously, people like Geronimo, Frank Williams. And then also, some of them end up in 361 Company. So they end up Crete, back to the Middle East. They stay as commandos for a while. And then they got sent to Algeria and form the nucleus of 361 Company, and then end up in UK. And some of those end up supporting number one Spanish company in the Ardennes. So a long journey for some of them. And a few of them end up back in the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, ironically, in 1943. Two of them end up, one of them, Villanova, he ends up getting the military medal for the crossing of the Volturno in October 1943 in Italy. Another guy called Mena, he's mentioned in dispatches. He's still serving in the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, at the end of World War II. So he must have gone on D-Day. He must have been in Germany, everything else. And then another guy, name escapes me now. He's injured on D-Day, at Normandy beaches. So you've got Spaniards who end up, these 30 or so. That's still a bit of a mystery, finding out if they were serving in one special service regiment or not, because the first elements of one special service regiment were heavily involved in Op Flipper. You've probably heard of Op Flipper. Op Flipper is the attempted assassination of Rommel, and I still can't prove it. We think that some of the landing parties that were not able to get into boats because it was so rough, not many of the groups were able to get to the beach. We think that some of those members were Spaniards who were from 50 Commando. But we can't prove it at the moment. So if that turns out to be the case, then that would be amazing. So that's the commandos. So you've got some of those who end up actually in the SAS and things like that as well. So you've got a gang of people there that have seen a lot of action. They've done a lot of things, and the commando story is pretty amazing, really. They're all proud. They were all proud members of the commandos.
I wonder what those men, if they ended up in with the West Sussex Regiment,
West Surrey.
I wonder what if those men, if they ended up in the West Surreys and they end up sort of the sole Spaniard in a unit of Brits. I wonder what the Brits thought of the Spaniard.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. I mean, I think the two that got Villanova, who got the military medal for the Volturno operation, that he was actually they were really useful with the Italian, you see. So I think that's why they were always at the forefront. He got the military medal for his actions on a reconnaissance and a fighting patrol that then he guided, having done the reconnaissance. He was very badly injured. I think he was invalided out of the army as a consequence, but he got shot in the back quite badly. But actually, his citation for his mention for his military medal is incredible, as is the citation for the mention in dispatches for Mena. They did really, really well. So they're quite amazing stories, really. And I think it's quite funny how they ended up back in the Queen's Royal Regiment after joining the British Army in 1940. So I think so. You've got people who've got continuous service. Obviously the Spanish Number One Company are probably the ones that have served the longest. And then, of course, you've got the people who are in the SAS. So through Phil Williams and a guy called Asher Pert, and also through the SAS Roll of Honor, I managed to get hold of information on at least 10 Spaniards who served in the SAS. I've already mentioned Francisco Geronimo, Frank Williams. You've got a guy called Justo Valerdi, who was called Robert Bruce. And then you've got a guy called Juan Torrens. I've already mentioned him, John Coleman.
They're great English names they're giving themselves.
Well, I'll talk about the story about their names, because there is a story behind that. Francisco Geronimo, again, he was in the 11th Battalion, Middle Eastern Commandos, Crete. He joined the Special Service Regiment, and then he became a member of the SAS. And he ended up in 2nd SAS. He was one of many who ended up not only in Normandy, but also in northern Italy on Operation Tombola, which I'm sure you're aware of. You've got Juan Torrens. He was similar. He ended up in 2nd SAS. But actually, Juan Torrens is one of those who started off in North Africa, along with another guy called Rafael Ramos. Now, Rafael Ramos, he got the military medal as well for his actions on Operation Tombola. And he's another North African recruit, let's say. Then you've got a guy called Angel Camarena. Now, Angel Camarena changed his name to Alan Cooper. Rafael Ramos was not allowed to change his name. So what basically happened was that Francisco Geronimo, Justo Valerdi, Juan Torrens, and Rafael Ramos were in a bar. They decided that they were going to change their names. Now, you can listen to Juan Torrens, John Coleman's life on the Imperial War Museum archives. It's free. Again, it's brilliant. John Coleman, look it up. It's brilliant. And he talked about his time in the Spanish Civil War and everything else. Anyway, long story short, they're in a bar and they decide that they're going to change their names because, you know, they just in case they get captured. Not great, is it? And all that. So Juan Torrens says, people say to Juan Torrens, you look a little bit like Ronald Colman. Now, Ronald Colman was a famous black and white actor who played Beau Geste. And of course, Juan Torrens, he'd done a little bit in the French Foreign Legion as well and all of that. So it made sense. So he decided to call himself John Coleman. Francisco Geronimo, he quite liked the idea of Walter Raleigh or Francis Drake. But actually, in the end, he went for Francis Williams or Frank Williams. And then Justo Valerdi ended up with Robert Bruce as his name. But Rafael Ramos wasn't allowed to change his. They said, just keep your name. So he was a bit annoyed about that. If you listen to Juan Torrens' account, he says that Rafael Ramos was a bit annoyed about it. And I've heard different stories. I've heard a story that Rafael Ramos didn't want to change his name. Either way, he didn't. So those were like the four amigos. They were really, really close. You've got a guy called Enrique Boganin, who changed his name to Henry Hall. And you've got a guy called Revuelta. Still can't find his first name yet. His name was Robert Shaw. And then you've got three others, Martin, Garcia, Cerrillos, and Bovio. Now, you're probably aware that at the beginning of 1944, the SAS was organized into a brigade. There were 5 regiments. Number 1 and number 2 were predominantly British. Number 3 and number 4 were French, and number 5 were Belgian. Well, actually, José García and Julio Cerrillos were members of 3 and 4 SAS, so they were actually part of the French SAS. Now, I've got in touch with the French SAS Association. There is a French SAS Veterans Association, and they're going to help me with finding any more Spaniards in 3 and 4 SAS. I haven't found anybody in 5 SAS, but we'll see what happens. So that's the story behind the names. But going through Angel Camarena's story is another amazing story where the kind of Spanish Civil War meets the Second World War. Angel Camarena ended up in the SAS, Alan Cooper, but his story is incredible. 1935, he was actually in the Spanish Army, in the regular Spanish Army. 1936, he was based in Tenerife. Franco was based in Tenerife just before the Spanish Civil War broke out. Angel Camarena was a chauffeur in the chauffeur pool. It may be the case that Angel Camarena drove Francisco Franco Baumonde around Tenerife when he was the commander of the Tenerife garrison. Now, I can't prove that yet because I'm waiting for his record to come from the Spanish archives, because he has got a record because he was in the Spanish Regular Army. But what is for sure is that he was arrested shortly after the beginning of the Spanish Civil War and condemned to death. He was put on a death penalty list of 26 soldiers that were condemned to death. He was very lucky. 20 out of the 26 were killed, were shot. 6 of them weren't. And the story is that he was put on a floating prison ship, and they had the prisoners put out on the deck. They were going to shoot them, and a British Royal Navy ship went past, and the prisoners were able to jump off the ship into the sea, and they were rescued by the British ship, but the British Royal Navy ship handed them back over to Spanish authorities on the condition that they weren't going to be shot. So he was then sent to an internment camp in Morocco from 1936 until 1941. He was in a concentration camp, basically, for Republican prisoners. He was then released and went back to Spain. He was free, but he didn't feel comfortable in the Spain of then. And somehow he ends up going to North Africa again and joining the British Army Pioneer Corps and joining the SAS. So what an amazing story. I mean, if it turns out that he was Franco's chauffeur, then, I've got it made. It's absolutely amazing. That is an amazing story.
It's interesting because he's not displaced as well, if you know what I mean. Like some of the others are out of the country. He's come from Spain to North Africa and... Yeah, very much so. I mean, there is a bit of a gap. His family have tried their hardest to find out as much information about what happened between 1941 when he was released and 1943 when he joined the Pioneer Corps. But they can't really find that much information. They know he was in Spain for a bit. He went to Madrid. He went to near Cadiz. Rio Tinto. Have you heard of Rio Tinto? Famous mines near Seville. So he went to visit family near there. And then he appears in 1943 in the Pioneer Corps. And then went to Philippeville, got trained through them, and then joined Special Forces. Do the British have they must have vetted these people, so there must be some paperwork somewhere of the British saying, who are you, where have you been? And
yeah, exactly. When you can get hold of these people's records, but you've either got to prove that they're dead by finding out their death, getting hold of their death certificate, or some means of proving that they're dead, or getting their relatives to put in the request to get their records. You can get these people records, and quite a lot of families I've spoken to have quite happily given me their fathers, grandfathers, uncles, great uncles records, because I'm able to pull together some of those key dates. I mean, the big gap we've got at the moment is the gap with those 30 odd Spaniards after Crete in the Middle Eastern Commandos. What happens between June 1941 and early 1943 when they become members of the Pioneer Corps in many cases? What happens? Some of them are on the books of the Middle Eastern Commando still. What does that mean? Are they in a training depot? Are they actually members of one special service regiment? We don't know. Some of the records are suitably vague. And of course, a lot of the records in North Africa were transferred from parts of North Africa to Jerusalem and then ended up in the UK. So, things get damaged, things get lost. It's quite normal. Those SAS soldiers are incredible. But the story of Tombola's the SAS operation in northern Italy in 1945. So a lot of the Spaniards are involved in operations in or around D-Day. There are two big operations they're involved in: True Form 2 and Dunhill. They're quite well known, and they're involved in those. And basically, they cause chaos behind the enemy lines. And as you know, the SAS are quite a large element by then. The forces in Italy need more activity behind the enemy lines, especially after the Gothic lines hit. So we're talking late 1944 into 1945. We're talking about crossing of the river lines. We're talking about the Po Valley. We're talking about the piercing of the Gothic line to get up north as quickly as possible. They need to cause that havoc behind the German lines. So Tombola is this very, very audacious attack that takes place. Basically, we're talking about Ferran, whereof he's the guy that actually comes up with the plan. And actually, 3 of the Spaniards are involved: Frank Williams, Robert Bruce, and Rafael Ramos. Obviously, Robert Bruce, Justo Valerdi. Sadly, Justo Valerdi is killed during that. And this attack is a coordinated attack where they're attacking various locations, but actually the main attack is on the headquarters of the 51st Mountain Corps in the mountains in Reggio Emilia. Justo Valerdi is killed in a jeep. I think he gets shot in the chest or in the head, killed outright. This attack is coordinated with SOE and with partisans, and I think there's Russians involved and all sorts. And it's marked by two key things from my point of view. One is that they have a Scottish piper that's parachuted in with them, who's playing something like Highland Laddie or something whilst the attack's going in. So there's no recriminations against the local population when the attack actually happens. So that's absolutely bonkers. And the second thing is Rafael Ramos, who is the third Spaniard in this group, he gets awarded the military medal. After the attack, he is able to carry with another member of the SAS. They carry away the intelligence officer. He's injured. I think he's shot in the back as well. They're able to carry him away and avoid capture for 4 days, and then reunite themselves with the SAS members after 4 days of evasion. So that, pretty amazing how they can get away with it, carrying a casualty, I believe, on an old ladder or something. It's quite amazing. Justo Valerdi is actually buried 3 times. He's buried on the spot. He's also then moved to a nearby cemetery, and then he ends up being moved to the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery in Milan.
Because they're working in small cells behind the lines in Italy, it is all very daring do, isn't it? The SAS, and they're not really doing those big unit actions that you kind of see where they're flying around in jeeps in at D-Day, which is a completely different kettle of fish.
Yeah, and these Spaniards are in the thick of it, and I think, of course, they're very much more of use in Italy because of the language than in France, maybe. Although obviously a lot of them could speak very good French anyway, because they've been serving in the French Foreign Legion, so they're still very useful in France as well. That's why a lot of them ended up working with the SOE as well, like I said. And then finally, you've got a couple of the waifs and strays. I've already talked about the 3 guys in the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey. You've got 2 guys who are Basque refugee children. One of them is called Lucio Saquillo Echevarria, a very Basque name. Another one's called Jose Irala. And these 2 are young men who have a different story to the other Spaniards. They're refugee children. They come to Britain in 1937. They're not able to go back to Spain or be claimed by their families at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and they stay in Britain. And both of them volunteer to join the British Army because of their willingness to want to fight. And Lucio Sauquillo Echevarria, very, very sparse name, he's killed just shortly after D-Day. He joins the British Army in 1942. He joins the 12th Yorkshire Battalion. He gets parachuted inland, and he is severely injured on the 12th of June and dies the following day. Yeah, and he's buried in one of the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries nearby. And then you've got Jose Irala, or Joe Irala. He's a similar story. He signs up in 1943 initially, and he then becomes a member of the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, so the Pathfinders, as we would call them today. He is parachuted into Arnhem on the 17th of September. He gets separated along with his troop commander. They end up getting into the rest of the squadron, end up meeting up at the divisional headquarters. On the 20th of September, he sets off to go and intercept a self-propelled gun, and he gets caught by machine gun fire and dies in a very similar way to Justo Valerdi in Italy. He's buried at Oosterbeek Cemetery as well, along with some of his comrades. So you've got some, amazing stories there. I mean, they're very different stories, very sad, the 2 of them, but actually they're very similar stories to the others, but actually they're different because they didn't go through the same sequence as the others. Their stories are very different, but nevertheless, for the 2 of them to volunteer like that, to join the parachute fraternity and go for it is quite a mean feat, really. No, not a mean feat at all. It's amazing stories.
What happens to them after the war? I got thinking about, like the Irish are shunned. The people from the Republic of Ireland are shunned if they'd fought in the British Army. What happens to you? Because these are displaced people.
Well, what happened? I mean, this is a very good story, and this is where Agustin Roa comes in. Agustin Roa was a politician in the anarchist movement. He wasn't an elected politician. He was heavily involved in supporting anarchist politics in Catalonia in the Spanish Civil War. His family wasn't from there. His family was from southern Spain, but they were economic immigrants and migrants, and they moved to Catalonia before the Spanish Civil War. And at the end of the Spanish Civil War, he obviously then goes into France. He gets interned. He then becomes a member of the resistance, and then he gets sent to Delfa concentration camp. Delfa concentration camp was 450 political prisoners, of which around 400 were Spanish. And a lot of them were either ex-senior military, ex-senior politicians, and obviously people like him who were heavily involved in the politics of Catalonia at the time, but also then got involved with the resistance. He then becomes a member of 361 Company. It's his accounts that are going to really help me close the book, because he met so many people due to his role at the end of the Second World War. He's able to fill a lot of gaps for me. So basically, he is one of those 3 companies that ends up back in the UK. And for those Spaniards who were in the UK at the end of the war, the British Army was actually looking at demobilizing them, which was normal practice at the location where they were first recruited. So in the case of the 3 companies and plenty of others who were recruited in North Africa, they were going to go back to North Africa, or some of them were even going to go to Italy. With the case of the SAS guys, the SOE guys, and the number 1 Spanish company, slightly different story. They still had nowhere to go. These people had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back to Spain. As these plans were being hatched and people were being told, yeah, you're going to be demobilized, you're going back to North Africa, of course, the Spaniards were losing the plot slightly. There was no way they were going to go back to North Africa, especially if they were sent back to somewhere like Morocco, which was still Spanish in some cases. Or if they're going to go back to Italy, what were they going to do in Italy? This is where Agustin Droa comes in. And Agustin Droa was one of 3 or 4 people that became the representatives for the Spaniards in Britain in 1945, 1946, more in 1946. And he was quite key to selling the case for the Spaniards to be demobilized and be given the opportunity to stay in Britain if they needed to. Some of his interactions actually involved him going to London, meeting with Labour MPs from the new Labour Party, the new Labour government in 1946. Of course, they're going to have more sympathy for the Republican cause. And he was able to get all the Spaniards the opportunity to stay in Britain if they wanted to. Now, they were given the option to leave. If they wanted to leave the country, they could. It wasn't an issue. They could go wherever they wanted, and there were options about them going to Mexico. A lot of Spaniards ended up in Mexico after the Spanish Civil War. The Mexican government was very open to allowing Republican Spaniards into their country. And it's at the end of the Second World War that the exiled Spanish community that had been forced out of Spain and taken exile in Britain during the Spanish Civil War and at the end of the Spanish Civil War meets these soldiers. And somebody like Agustin Roa is the key interlocutor between these groups. And as a consequence of representing a lot of these people, he is able to find out a lot about their stories, where they came from, what they did. But the key thing that he does is he sets up Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association. So he sets up the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association, and after a certain point in time, and I still don't know the full story about this, they are allowed, supposedly, to go to the cenotaph every year and lay a wreath. And I've got a photo of a group of Spaniards from across the elements of the British Army where they served, waiting for their turn to go past the cenotaph and lay a wreath, dated 1975. And one of the people who is in that group is Luis Portillo, or Luis Portillo, as we would know him, the father of Michael Portillo. Michael Portillo's father was an academic from Salamanca University, as you're probably aware, and he was heavily involved in the exiled community in Britain at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and again was one of these key people that brought a lot of these elements of the Spanish community together, especially when you have in the region of potentially around 500 or so Spaniards who ended up in Britain. Not all of them ended up in Britain permanently, but then at the end of the war, we're roughly talking about that amount. So you can see that, okay, the Spaniards were extremely let down by Britain because they felt that Spain would be next. They felt that Franco was going to be ousted. So they felt very let down by people like Churchill and people like that at the end of the Second World War. And of course, it's very well documented now that, of course, Franco's outer kind of circle, inner circle, were being paid off by the British government as well in the early parts of the Second World War in order to try and keep Spain out of the war. And obviously then the adversary, let's put it that way, became Russia, and the Cold War started and the Iron Curtain came down on Western Europe. and Spain was seen as a very strategically important part of Europe. So therefore, it was never going to be the case that Franco was going to be ousted. So a lot of these Spaniards felt disgusted. Some of them even threw their medals away. Some of them didn't stay in Britain and went to Mexico. But of those who stayed, they seemed to assimilate themselves. They seemed to be part of British and Spanish communities in the UK. They were all over Britain. You've got communities predominantly in London, but you've got communities in Scotland, Wales, parts of Britain, other parts of England, things like that. So ultimately, these are people who settle and who marry into British families. Some of them even marry other Spaniards as well, like the refugee children, people like that. Phil Williams' grandmother, for example, his grandfather married a Basque refugee child. Ultimately, they settle in and they live a life of exile, and then in 1975 Franco dies, and a lot of them actually end up going back to Spain and buying property there, or some of them settle back in Spain. Agustin Roa was one of them. He went back to Spain in 1978. He died in Spain. A lot of them stay in Britain, and they were all issued with medals. They were all veterans. They were regarded as aliens initially. They were given the opportunity to become naturalized Britons. A lot of them, I've got a lot of their naturalization papers, late 40s, early 50s. A lot of them became naturalized. Some of them chose not to become naturalized. I've got a couple of stories. There's one guy who was in the 50 Middle Eastern Commando who became a mafia gangster who never wanted to become naturalized Briton. So you've got a real mix, but ultimately they settle in Britain for good or bad. They become part of British society, and they accept tea drinking and strange customs that we have in their eyes, and they are ultimately, the majority, I would say, extremely proud of being members of the British Army, even though they feel let down in some cases. They know that it's not necessarily the army that's doing it. They know it's the politicians. They are very political in their beliefs. The majority of these people are quite left, well, more than quite left wing. Some of them are anarchists and communists, but ultimately they are fighting in the same cause and they want to make a difference. So that's really the story in a nutshell.
It's a fantastic story, and the interesting thing, as you say, it's the motivation to motivate these men for nearly 10 years of fighting.
Some of them don't get demobbed until 1946. Some of them 1947.
So you go through one war into another war.
In some cases, three wars, really, because they fought the French in the middle as well. So, and a lot of these people didn't talk about it, and they felt very much, there's a famous book stroke film called Los Olvidados, the Forgotten Ones. They did feel, and that's mostly more about the Spaniards who fought with the French. There is still a bit of a controversy amongst quite a lot of Spaniards about how they felt they were treated by the French and how they felt let down by the French quite a lot. I think, sadly, by the time the end of the Second World War, they were kind of used to it. So it did come as a surprise from Britain to a certain extent. But I think because they were treated a lot better, it wasn't so bad in their eyes, maybe.
And I remembered in Spain, because if you move back to Spain, you might not want to talk about it.
Yes and no. I mean, more so now, obviously, during the Franco period, no way. They were persona non grata, like all the exiled Spaniards were. But ultimately, there are lots of stories being written about them. In the last 10, 15 years, as archives have become more available, they have certainly been written on. I mean, a lot of the Spaniards who fought in the French armed forces were not fully recognised, just like some of the African troops were not fully recognised until the 1970s. In France. So that really, really does goad, a lot of Spaniards. Probably one of the most famous Spanish units, apart from the Spaniards who served in the French Foreign Legion, a lot of them ended up continuing and filling up the ranks of the Foreign Legion in North Africa, and the 13th Half Brigade, very famous for Bir Hakeim, and being subsumed into the 8th Army. There were loads of Spaniards by that stage in that brigade, even more than there were earlier on in the war. But the most famous unit of the Spanish, Spaniards who served in the British and the French army were the ones who were in La Nueve, the 9th Reconnaissance Company. That was a company of about 140, of which about 130 were Spaniards. And they were the people who actually entered Paris in August 1944. Spain was liberated by a company of Paris was liberated by a company of Spaniards. They actually arrested the governor. The fact that he didn't want to surrender to them and they had to go and find a French officer to do so is another matter. But ultimately, they were the first Free French army forces to enter into Paris. But I mean, and then there's lots of cases of those kind of things, of Spaniards being very heavily involved and at the front of things in the British Army, like I've said, with the SAS commandos and things like that. So they were always going for broke because they were very enthusiastic about what they did and they want to continue their fight.
Well, Sean, thank you. That was great. I enjoyed that very much. It's a good story. It's a forgotten part of the war. Folks, keep your eyes peeled to the Facebook page. I'll post up the links to the interviews Sean mentioned. If you've not already liked the Facebook page, you can find me at, unsurprisingly, WW2Podcast. If you'd like more from Sean and I talking, I'll also post something up for patrons of the podcast. If you've not already signed on to be a patron, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast to find out how to join the gang of loyal listeners and receive extra bits of World War II chat when I have them. Next time out, we'll be looking at the Eastern Front in 1944. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.